This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Marvin, who's going to say a few words about the Dreer Award.
One of the wonderful things about Cornell is there are these pockets of money around, and people don't often know about it. There's a pretty big pocket of money called the Dreer Award that was set up to allow graduate students to travel somewhere internationally to supplement their career or their research or whatever. And it's about $28,000 a year. And sometime in March, April, we invite graduate students to submit a proposal. It's very onerous. They have to submit 5 or 6 pages of what they want to do. They have to meet with a committee of 3 for like 20 minutes and explain what they're going to do. And we make a decision. It's like easiest money you would ever get. The only requirement is after you travel and you do your study, you come back and give a seminar to all of us. It's open to landscape, architecture, and horticulture graduate students. And our speaker today was the recipient of the Dreer Award. So we'll let Justine introduce.
All right, I'll come up to the microphone just so the online folks can hear me. Hello, everyone. My name is Justine Vandenhoevel. I'm a professor of viticulture in SIPS, and I'm pleased to be here to introduce Coby Chock. So Coby's undergrad is from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he grew up in Hawaii. He did spend a semester at University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he actually took his first viticulture course. His background is in economics, and when he was here, we actually combined that. He did a cost analysis of a spatial sampling protocol that we had designed, and that paper was recently published in the American Journal of Enology and Viticulture. So I'm very proud of the work that he's done here. It's been a pleasure to have him in my lab. I'm glad he has kept up the long line of my students who have then gotten the Dreer and gone off and done amazing things around the country. So we're thrilled to have him here. Welcome, Coby. Nice to have you back.
Thank you, Justine. So first, I'd like to thank Justine and thank the Dreer Committee, as well as all of the people who made it possible for me to go and learn all the things that I did abroad. So as you can see, my presentation today is going to be covering tropical viticulture. It's something that's a little different than standard winemaking and standard viticulture. And the reason I'm interested is, as Justine mentioned, I'm from Hawaii, and down the road, I plan on starting a vineyard and winery in Hawaii. So we'll get started. So this picture here is of me at the vineyard I was interning at in Thailand in the Khao Yai region. So the regions that I visited is in Thailand, Brazil, and India, particularly in Thailand. It was in the Khao Yai area, as I mentioned previously. The winery I was at is Grand Monte Vineyard and Winery. This region up here is further north than some of the other regions that also have vineyards and wineries. However, the largest concentration of wineries were located in this region right here. Generally, Thailand has 2 significant seasons that are pretty consistent every year. They have a winter and then a summer. And in the winter, they have a monsoon season and then a dry season. So the monsoon season, as you can imagine, is very wet. They don't propagate or grow any vines, grapes that year, that part of the year. And in that time, they just pretty much prune and expect vegetative growth. They don't want any grapes because even if they had grapes, it would be swelled with water. They would get a lot of diseases, and it's just not worth producing any grapes during that time period. Further down south in this area, there's another vineyard that's a little warmer. The vineyard also has a monsoon season, so they also don't go and have 2 yields per year. But they have a lot more sandy soil. And then to this region on the right, there is one vineyard that actually closed. So they're no longer there, but this region was closer to the region, the southwest. The second region that I visited is in Petrolina, Brazil. In Petrolina, it is described as semi-arid. It is very dry for the most part. When I was there, they said that it was actually the wettest they had been in 10 years. Once in every 10 years, they get a lot of rain and it was actually flooding, but it's so rare that they can continuously harvest 365 days a year, perpetually. And it's one of the most unique regions that I visited for that reason. A little further south in Brazil, as more of you are familiar with, is Sao Paulo, where they have other vineyards in 3 different regions. Up here, a little bit to the north of Sao Paulo, a little bit further south, and then to the west of Sao Paulo. And this is a little bit closer to the traditional 30 to 50 latitude that you would expect wine to be grown in, but they grow it here and it's pretty unique as well. And the last place I visited was in India. It was in the Nashik region. And in the Nashik region, it is also pretty dry and arid. It can be, I would say, a little bit cooler than a lot of the other regions I visited. But it's still within the tropics. Unlike if you went to further south in India, it would be in the traditional latitude as well. So I'm going to go through, instead of describing each place that I visited, just the vineyard management practices, and we can kind of see how things were different or similar. So this is vine propagation. As you can imagine, because vineyards aren't as common in these regions, they don't really have a large supply of vines. A lot of the vines that they do have were all imported in small shipments, and then it was grown based off of the material that they already had. So, of course, this is going to bring up problems of potential virus transmission as you propagate vines that have viruses already. But at the same time, certain vineyards, especially this one that I was at in Thailand, they tried to take precautions to kind of prevent or at least mitigate the risk. So as you can see on the top left, this is the fresh cuttings that they got from the vines in the vineyard. We defoliated the branches and then pruned them to lengths of about a foot, maybe a little longer. As you can see in the bottom left, this is when we were, I guess, sterilizing the vine. So after we pruned them, we stuck them in a hot water bath at, I believe it's 50 degrees Celsius, maybe it's 80 degrees Celsius for about 30 minutes. And there's some papers about using this method to kind of kill any diseases that are present and try to prevent the spreading of any trunk diseases. Once we finished that, they were stuck in pots with, instead of like cocoa coir, they have a lot of rice down there. So it was that rice hull fine material. And the tops of the vines were painted with paint mixed with fungicide to kind of close the wound on the top. After a few months, or actually a couple months, then this picture here is what the result was. And you can see something similar when I visited Petrolina in Brazil, where they also propagated all of their own vines as well. For vineyard establishment, it was pretty standard. In Thailand, or in India, they kind of just planted vines in the ground. Of course, you don't have to wait for fall or spring. You can just plant whenever you feel like it. And then in Thailand, they did something a little bit more unique. Instead of grafting the vines before planting, they actually planted the rootstocks and then field grafted. Their explanation to me of why they did this is because instead of having the scion that has your desired grape variety on top immediately, allowing the rootstock to take off and be as vigorous as I can to really establish its root system is what they were going for. And then later we would go into grafting, and that'll be the next slide. But I just thought this was a little interesting on the right. It's nothing special. It's just a grapevine, but instead of using a stick to pull it up vertically, they tie it on like this fishing line almost and tie it to the top trellis. And I just thought that was different. I hadn't seen it previously, but we'll move to the graftings.
Could you comment just briefly on the sparkling that people
Yes.
asked that report, where it's from? He didn't.
Yeah, so this is from that Brazil region that I mentioned previously in Petrolina. The variety is Muscatel, which is a type of muscat, I guess. And this is a really common wine from the region. That dry, semi-arid region primarily makes white wine and sparkling wines. For red wines, it's just not the best climate for it, I guess, because there isn't enough fluctuation in temperature between day and night, and they also receive a lot of sun. So they said that whenever they get certain red grapes, it comes out very light and the tannins break down and there's nothing left as far as complexity in the reds. So this is one of the most popular wines. This bottle, I believe, is under $5 US. So the market is to the local Brazilian wine drinkers who are relatively new, I guess, to wine because they like their beers. But yeah, this is Muscat. Where was I? Okay, grafting. So for grafting, this is field grafting. We took the cyan variety that was refrigerated from the previous pruning in the monsoon season. It was taken out of the refrigerator, the rootstock was split down the middle, and then the cane is shaved to a flat point. It was cleft grafting. And one bud is cut from that cane and inserted into the slot and then wrapped tightly with this plastic wrap. Pretty standard cleft grafting. But one of the things that they noticed here is sometimes the plastic gets into the graft union, which will cause the vine to die after a few years. So that's one of the downsides of this. And it's also a lot more labor intensive to go into the field rather than bench grafting in a room. Now we'll move to training systems. And this is another very unique thing to the tropical regions. More often than not, for the wine grapes, you would see double cordon or single cordon VSP systems, as you see on the top right. This is the Grand Monte Winery in Thailand, and this typically works very well for them. But in addition to that, for the more vigorous varieties, I think the only variety that winery did cane pruning was for their Muscat. Otherwise, it was all double cordon spur pruning. The training system that you saw in Brazil was often similar, although sometimes you saw high wire cordons in this middle picture. And in Brazil, because the region is also known for their table grape growing, they had regular pergolas that they also grew table grapes on, but they did this for wine grapes. And it was interesting. I think this method is unique, but at the same time, there's a lot less control over how many buds you have, how many clusters you have, unless you go through and kind of go underneath to really look at everything. But because this vineyard didn't have too much mechanical operations, it wasn't a big problem. And this middle picture at the bottom is in India, where, as you can see, their training system is also this Y system. Justin, do you know the name for where they split it into a Y?
It's called the Y system.
Y system. There we go. And in Thailand, they also use this. And this is actually where they saw the best quality grapes and the highest yields. But Thailand didn't regularly use this for all of their grapes because they can't mechanize really anything in that block. So it makes it more challenging. This system on the bottom right is in Thailand as well, but they use it for rootstock growth so that they can propagate. And it's just a really easy method for them to grow the grapes. So that's why they use it. So as far as pruning goes, in Thailand, the first thing they did was count the clusters. So they split the buds to see how many inflorescence they're expecting for the year to kind of estimate how many buds to prune to. Typically, it's 5 to 6 buds per spur, and they would only keep a couple on the top. As you see, they use diagonal pruning. Some people say that it's better, some don't, but that's what they use. The 5 to 6 buds per spur is what they said to be a better amount of spurs to keep for yield rather than vegetative growth at the lower buds. And then similar to how we did the grafting, they also sealed the pruning wounds with a mix of fungicide with paint. So the growing cycle is something that is very distinct from anywhere else. As I mentioned before, in Thailand, they are able to have 2 growing seasons, but they only harvest in one. So you can kind of look at this and see they have the rainfalls average between 2001 and 2011, as well as temperatures. They have noticed that it has gotten warmer, and the rain has been a little bit more variable because of climate change. But I thought this was a good chart to show because it really covers and highlights a lot of different things happening in the vineyard throughout the growing season. So you see pruning number 1 happens in April through May, and that's all vegetative. And then pruning number 2 happens September through October, and then fruit set. And this is when they're looking to get their quality grapes here. You can also see a distinct drop in rainfall in the season, 24 millimeters versus between 120 and 220. So that's a pretty distinct difference in rainfall, and which is why they go with this season to be the fruiting season. The pest pressures is also down here below. I'm going to cover some of these pests a little bit more later, but you can see at different points in the season they experience these diseases. And of course, birds will always be there, but can't do too much about that other than putting a net or making some noise with cannons or lasers. So to be able to do what they do here, they induce dormancy. So prior to pruning, they spray ethifon. And what this does is really kind of prep the plant and induce it into dormancy. And we prune it and we also defoliate. They go ahead and remove the leaves with like a hedger. They have people going through just taking off the bulk of the vegetation there. But that is generally how it's done. About a couple days later, they will then apply hydrogen cyanamide to the buds. And I believe some spray it, but the vineyard I was interning at, particularly in Thailand, they would actually go and get the mixture and then paint it onto the buds rather than just spraying broadly, because I guess the buds is where it needs this application. You can see bud burst. This is in Thailand maybe a week after bud burst, a couple weeks. And then this is almost immediately after bud burst in Brazil. So this,
Does the ethifon help to defoliate the plants at all, or do they have to really go in and kind of aggressively defoliate?
so they sprayed this about right before I got there. So I'm not exactly sure what it did. I did notice that there were some less leaves, but there were still a significant amount of leaves that needed to be pulled off by hand. So it wasn't 100%, no.
Coby, everyone has your second wine, which
Yes.
first right there.
Yeah, so the second wine here is from Thailand. It's a Shiraz. Because they're close to Australia, they use a lot of the Australian terms for these wines. And this is from Monsoon Valley. It's the largest winery in Thailand. Trying to think a little bit about this wine. I believe this winery, they use hyperoxidation in the beginning of the fermentation process and then ferment it more or less normally through the end and blend it with the different blocks to try to get something consistent from year to year. And try to keep these in mind because at the end I'd like to ask your thoughts on these different wines. Okay, so fruit set. Fruit set happen pretty normally as you would expect. So I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly, but the biggest problem that they experienced is downy mildew, as we could really get to the inflorescence before it even sets, causing a big loss. Something unique again with these regions is because they don't have a winter coming up, they can't afford to be a little late on the harvest. And there was one block that we visited that was, I think, contracted out, but we still went to check it out and see how it was. It had very, very poor fruit set. It had almost nothing because of downy mildew. And this was already a month or two into the season, but they just pruned again and started all over. And I wasn't there for when they harvested this block, but I assume it worked out because they, like I said, they have a lot of time to get the fruit in. So this is some of the canopy management that they do in India. I noticed probably the least canopy management. They were generally the messier vineyards that I visited, as far as weed control and general maintenance of the vineyard. And then in Brazil, you see them kind of just taking a handheld hedging tool to cut everything that's hanging out into the rows. And then in Thailand, this was probably the most painful thing I did while I was there. They gave us lopping shears, and we had to go overhead and lop all day for a couple days. And we tried to keep it within the trellis wires so that way the growth was vertical. Whereas, and then when we lopped, we just took off the tops, the tips. Whereas in Brazil, some of these were hanging out of the side of the trellis, so they'd be cutting some branches very short, doing it this way. But labor is really cheap in Thailand, so that's why they had just a few of us going out there and manually removing the top. This is some of the other canopy management that we did. We'd remove all the downward facing shoots, because generally you don't want those. And then early in the season before bud burst, we went through and removed all the little buds that were coming up across from the future clusters. And they really try to keep the fruit zone open for disease reasons as well as ripening. So we went through before the vine got massive and really vigorous and removed all of these little shoots here. We also removed, this is shoot selection. So like I said, we only select 2 shoots per spur, and that way you don't have too much vigor across the vine, because it, as you can see here, it already gets pretty developed in terms of leaf development and fruit development. So we go through and leaf pull for better air circulation and sun exposure. We leaf pulled only on one side, and this was the side that was facing the west. And that way in the morning, it would be kind of protected from the sun. In midday, the whole canopy will protect it, and then it'll get a little bit more sun exposure in the afternoons. But you can see how much they leaf pull. They pretty much remove all the leaves from the lower part of the canopy, and then a lot from the fruit zone as well. So it's a lot of vegetative management. In terms of irrigation, it was all water sources that were available right on site. So on the left, this is Petrolina. It's a big lake, the San Francisco River. So this lake is what they pull the water into through this pump system, and then would irrigate their fields with it. In Thailand, similarly, this is the vineyards, the main vineyard site, where they have this big pond that they have this pump house that would pump water through to the vineyard, and they would use this for fertigation as well. And in another site in Thailand, they also have water right there. I don't have a picture of this, but in the southern vineyard in Thailand, that is a little bit more sandy. Of course, they have better drainage. It's also a little drier. So they need to be watering it a little more frequently, because, you know, generally if there's sandy soil, the water is just going to go right through and you're not going to have a lot of retention. But they also had a water shortage for that year, so they had to determine which blocks they would just kind of neglect for the year and not water. So there were certain blocks, because of water shortages, that they just wouldn't water because there is no county water. It's not really feasible to bring in water. So like many other regions, especially in California, water can be a problem, but it's generally not in a lot of tropical regions. Now we can pour this next one. I guess before we get there, let me just see. Okay. So this next wine is a Justine, how do you say it? Barbera.
Barbaric.
Barbera. And this Barbera is from Brazil as well. Typically, it's known to be a little bit more tannic and a bigger wine. But in this region, as I said before, it's also a region that is known not to have great reds and known to have low tannins. So we will see what your thoughts are, because typically the better wines that I tried were the ones that were typically supposed to be bolder, because I guess when you have that loss, you still have a higher amount to begin with. So when you lose some of the tannin, then it's not as big of a deal. But again, I didn't try this one, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So for the other side of it, because it is so tropical, sometimes you have a lot of rain. In Thailand, you have the monsoon season, a lot of rain. In Brazil, generally you don't have too much, but when you do, it can be a problem. And across all of the regions, I noticed raised grow like kind of mounded growing. So on the left side, this is India. And you can see that there's a hump where the vines are planted in the row. And this is also Brazil on the right. And I thought I put one of Thailand in here, but I don't have it. So they did that to kind of keep the water table a little bit lower by having the vines start off at a higher point. And then aside from that, there were also vineyards in Brazil where they had trenches that they dug to kind of help, instead of tile drainage where you dig, you set the tiles and then you kind of cover it back up. They just dug it and left it open. And they have pipes, or not pipes, other trenches going across this way in some rows that drain into this main trench. So this is a way that they kind of either lowered the water table or kept the root zone a little bit drier. So some of the major pests that were there are worms, caterpillars, and thrips, as well as mealybugs. So looking here, can anybody define or see any pests here? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So it's right here on this leaf. You can't really see it. I believe that's a mealybug. This is for sure a mealybug. Anyone know what this is? No. These are worm eggs. So you'll see this worm in the tropics quite a bit. I'm not sure if they're common here or not, but these are the egg nests for these worms here. There are also large caterpillars in Thailand. So that is, it's kind of freaky when you came across one of these. And then there were these weird horn beetles that would bore into some of these trunks. And it basically ate into this spur across part of this trunk and went in this way. And we kept cutting back, and then it wasn't there. But we ended up cutting off this whole part of the cordon because it was eaten through. It was a big hole. Not too common, but it is there. Aside from insect pests, there are also other animal predation pests, such as birds. In Brazil, you would have these big birds, and sometimes toucans come and eating your grapes. And in Thailand, you would have monkeys coming in from the forest, as well as once in a while, you'd have elephants marching into the vineyard. And they had barbed wire or fencing all around the place, but there's one section where the elephant didn't care, and they just come right through, and not much you can do about that. So it's kind of a tough situation there, but luckily it's not too common. For viruses, Rupestre stem pitting is a common one. Leaf roll is another. Because, as I mentioned, they propagate their own vines and there's no virus-free initiatives there. There will be more of these viruses present. I believe this is some kind of virus. I can't say exactly what it is. It could be possibly leaf roll. Do you have any idea, Justine, or anybody? Yeah, hard to say. And then this trunk was also split could be virus, maybe not. What virus, I'm not sure. And there's Botryopharia trunk disease as well. And this is what I'm being shown here by the vineyard manager in southern Thailand. And he is actually from Germany. He did an internship there and liked it. He was asked to stay, so he stayed there, and he's been working there for about 12 years now. But it's interesting because this guy, as well as the person I was working with, both were trained in the more traditional regions. He was trained in Germany. The person that I was working under in Thailand, she was trained in Australia. So they both have a better idea of some of the scientific developments and other good practices. Weed management was another thing. As I mentioned, people spray. India didn't really have too much weed management happening. One vineyard in Thailand had sheep that they were let through their field. This was a organic vineyard, so they tried to not use too many things. But sheep, and then in this other vineyard I was interning at, they used hose, these wide base hose, and we kind of just dug up the weeds under the vines. Again, it took a lot of manual effort, but works, I guess. And diseases, downy mildew, powdery mildew, anthracnose are common. Some anthracnose on these grapes here. Mildew on this leaf. I think it's powdery on this one. Just a lot of disease in here. And this is the organic vineyard here, so that's probably why. And what they did for this is they had their typical sprays. But in addition to that, they would use some other things. My notes didn't transfer, but they have other sprays such as this type of, if I can find it. Yeah, sorry, this presentation was supposed to be on my laptop here, but then it wasn't working, so I put it here and didn't share this other part, but it's some kind of biological control. I can look it up after and let you know what it was. Continuous harvesting in Brazil. I just wanted to touch on this. I mentioned it previously, but unlike Thailand, where they have so much rain in one season and no rain in the other, they were just dry year round, so they could just continuously harvest. As soon as they prune the vine, you could then go ahead and start the next growing season. So all of these pictures were all happening within 1 month of each other. And as you can see, they're all in very different stages. Here you have recently pruned, no bud burst at all. And then here you see vegetation. I believe they're just across the aisle from each other, but in very different stages. And then another vineyard at the same time is also almost ready to harvest here. So again, a very unique opportunity for these vineyards, and possibly a unique opportunity to explore further as well. Outside of that, here are some other interesting things that I didn't really expect. But can anybody see the snake in this bottom picture? Yeah. And then the snake head here. So and then this is when it came out, but I was actually stepping on this snake when we were grafting. I was sitting down on a stool, I was cutting the vine, and I felt the ground moving under me. I didn't know what it was. So I stop, I kind of look, and then I get back to work and I feel it again, and I really wasn't sure what it was. And then I thought maybe I was just dehydrated because it was very hot. It was in the mid-90s with like 90% humidity, full sun. It was brutal. But it was a snake, and what we ended up doing for the next hour is catching the snake. And then we released it right across the street, so it probably came right back the next hour. But we caught the snake, and this is a different snake. This is a tree snake, and a little bit more scary because when we're working in the canopy, you might accidentally touch the snake or get too close and it might bite you. Luckily, someone saw it, and then we whacked it with a stick, and this one died, so this one won't be coming back. And this is just another thing that I wanted to bring up. I wasn't really sure what to make of it, but air roots were very common. You don't see it as much, I would say, here, but they were on a lot of the vines, and quite a bit of it too. So I don't know if anyone here has any experience with why this might be the case in the tropics. Just wanted to kind of.
See it a lot in more humid regions. So Long Island, for example, it's actually quite common, aerial roots. We don't see it very often up here unless it's very humid here.
Okay. So it's just the humidity, somehow the plant wants to. Okay. Yeah, well, this is very typical to see. And these are just some of the people that I worked with who hosted me while I was there. This is one of the vineyards that they grew table grapes, but they also made wine. This is the third wine, this last one that you just had, was from this vineyard that they grew it on an overhead pergola. This is another block of the same vineyard. In this picture, it is in another Petrolina vineyard. I believe this is the. Okay, this is a different one, but yeah, that's good. Thank you. I thought there was one. This first one that you had the sparkling was this vineyard that I visited, and they make a lot of sparkling. They also make wine for a lot of different labels. It was just a huge facility. And then these are the people that I interned, worked with in Thailand here. And of course, there has to be a vineyard dog. Thailand had vineyard 5 dogs. A lot of them are wild. But this one was named Nam Tam. And yeah, we can move to question as Manushi pours this last wine that is from Thailand. This is the vineyard that I interned at. I thought that they had the best wine overall that I tried. So yeah.
What cultivar is this one?
This is a Petit Syrah Dreer.
Season in Thailand. What is the typical timeline for production there? Or do they try to avoid the monsoon season, or do they figure out a way to work that in?
No, they pretty much have a full growing cycle during the monsoon season. They just remove all the grapes so the plant can just have vegetative growth. Because unfortunately, and fortunately, I guess, the vines don't experience any natural dormancy. And because of that, it's going to keep growing. And you can make it here. You can make it dormant, but you can't make it stay dormant for too long. It's going to come back sooner than later. So rather than just keep killing everything that's out there, they just let it grow, let it just have vegetation, and then prune it before the season that they want. As you can see here, in September they prune. Fruit set's going to be in October, and it's September through October because a lot of different blocks take time to go through, and they also start off with, I believe, the reds and then do the whites because the whites have a shorter growing season. Fruit set happens here generally and then grows through December, January, and then the sparkling they'll harvest in January typically. You can do an earlier harvest, and the reds, February, the bigger reds like this one, maybe Cabernet Sauvignon, could be end of March. Sometimes I think it can go through maybe early April, but usually by March, that's the end. Yeah. Yes.
How about nutrient management? What kind of fertilizer that they use, and do they use like organic fertilizer?
Organic isn't too big of a thing. So most of the vineyards don't do organic. That one that I showed you with the sheep is the only one that I know of who goes out of their way to use organic management. As far as the exact types of fertilizer, I'm not sure. This is a discussion that I had with Justine yesterday about some of the pesticides and fungicides that they use. I asked about it, and they gave me this sheet, their spray schedule, and half of it's in Thai. And when you translate, it didn't exactly come out. So I'm not exactly sure what they do, but I do know that they fertigate across, I think, several of the different vineyards I went to, they fertigate quite a bit. So I'd assume it's more or less standard, and it's going to kind of depend on the situation at each vineyard, depending on what they need for their soil. Yes.
I've already mentioned this, but regarding the amount of like sunlight, cloud cover that you can see throughout the growing seasons that people choose, do you find that some regions had more consistent sunlight or is it variable?
So this is for Thailand specifically. Um, Generally in September, October, it's still the very edge or like end of monsoon season. So there's some rain and cloud cover. Once you get to the end of October, November, it is very, very sunny, very hot, uh, all the way through December and then January. So they get a lot of sun. If you go further south to the other vineyard, it is also very sunny, hotter too. In India, it can also be fairly sunny, although there are clouds. Um, in Brazil, it would also be very sunny as well. So all of these regions had a lot of sun, cloud cover occasionally, but it wasn't a regular thing, and it's not to be expected either too often.
Maybe even in the other regions. What is the lifespan of the grapes if they're continuously growing and producing? Is it shorter, and do you have to do more replants?
That's a great question. So I've heard that in the southern part of Brazil, they do have to do replants a little more often, or actually, it's not the southern, the northern part of it, they need to do it more often. That's what I heard from some people who told me outside of there. But when I spoke to the folks at one of the vineyards there, they were saying it's so new that they're not entirely sure how long the vines will last. They only really planted about 30 years ago, and that's their oldest block. And they haven't had to do a replant yet for that block. And that's one of the most established, longest, lasting vineyards there. So as far as they know, no, it's not any shorter. But at the same time, we don't really know for certain. Yes.
So with the continuous harvesting thing, so you mentioned sprays to force dormancy.
Yes.
If you're doing continuous harvesting, can you get more grapes to grow just by pruning, or you always have to spray something to force the vine into dormancy first? Or can you just prune it and it'll grow more grapes?
You could prune it. I think the idea behind spraying is to kind of allow the plant sometime to pull back some nutrients back to its roots and like kind of store. But in terms of being able to just prune, that's a possibility. I'd say the bigger thing is coming out of dormancy, applying the ethifon, or is it ethifon? No, the cyanamide. Yes, the cyanamide is a bigger thing because you will get bud burst regardless of whether you apply that or not. But this allows for more uniform bud burst. Otherwise, what you may see is bud burst towards the edges because of apical dominance, whereas the middle might not have very much, or it might be weaker growth. And because the outer ones are going to be a lot more developed by the time the middle one even bursts, it's going to have uneven ripening if you have fruit, and it could just the outer ones could overtake the middle, and the middle might not grow enough at all. So that's the bigger thing. And one of the vineyards in Brazil specifically mentioned instead of using cyanamide, they use a garlic mix, like it's garlic in water, and they put that on, and it works. I don't know if it works. I think I heard a couple of people using that, and the organic winery in Thailand also said that. I think it needs to be looked at a little more. I did see one paper that kind of mentions that. If I find it, I can send it out, but it is supposedly effective. I can take it with a grain of salt.
Coby,
Marvin?
There's a question for just a general Dreer outlook. So I assume you're not fluent in Portuguese or Thai. So how did it work, not being a native speaker and communicating with growers and the managers and so forth? And would you advise other students to go to places even though they might not speak that language?
Yeah, the experience was pretty good. With the places that I got more from, I would say, were the ones that spoke some English. As I mentioned, the place I interned at, she spoke English. She studied in Australia. She knew kind of what she was doing. As far as, in addition, the one in the south, he was in Germany. Germans speak English more or less, and he also had a good idea of what he's doing. So I think it is a great thing to go out and meet other people from other places, and there's almost always someone who can speak English, and if not, like in let's see, Thailand, some places nobody spoke English. Some people only spoke Portuguese in Brazil. But I mean, we live in a good time when we have Google Translate and there's a transcribe feature. So I could just record and they speak and I could just read exactly what they're saying. So there's a lot of great opportunity now that you can do that type of thing with people that you wouldn't have been able to before, but now you can. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a limiting factor at all. Yes. Yeah. So after they prune, some of it is used for propagation, and then the rest of it is dumped into the forest or somewhere because we're in a very rural area and there's nobody around. They just have a big pile generally.
And it gives a very nice aroma to the meat.
Yeah. I think in Thailand, one of the vineyards did sell some of the cuttings. They dried out cuttings for that. But I don't think it's a tradition or something that everyone regularly does in any of these countries. So it's mostly either composted or thrown off to the side, something like that. Yeah.
What do you think you'll learn? What do you think you've learned that you'll apply to your time in, or when you set up a place in Hawaii?
A lot. So one of the things I did notice is certain varieties just don't do well at all. In Brazil, they didn't work. In Thailand, they didn't work. And one of those varieties is like Pinot Noir. In Thailand, they could barely get the plant to grow. It's there, but it has no fruit, and it's been maybe 4 or 5 years now. And then in Brazil, there was a vineyard that is growing Pinot Noir, but I think they're only getting about maybe 1 case of wine per acre or something crazy low. And they have to charge a ridiculous amount for that bottle because it just costs a lot to do. And yeah, it's just certain varieties don't work. Certain ones do. Petit Syrah are very good, as well as the canopy management. Another thing that I forgot to mention in preventing disease is whenever it rains, to prevent downy mildew, they will just take the sprayer through the vineyard rows and they'll just turn the fan on high and blow off the water. They won't spray anything, and that's just to dry out the flowers so that they don't get downy mildew. That's something that I would probably do because it's, from what I understand, it makes all the difference in preventing downy.
Maybe last question, and then we got to wrap up.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. I just was gonna ask, what is the market or how has the market changed for these wines in these regions? And I guess, are they exporting a lot or is it just kind of staying?
In Thailand, the market is very small. Their religion, I think it's Buddhism. They actually weren't supposed to drink, I think at one point, the strict Buddhists, and the newer ones do. But a lot of it's beer. Song beer and Chang are the 2 most common. Wine is a very new thing. It's starting to grow. You see some domestic tourists coming to visit the vineyard, but generally it's the wealthier ones because, I mean, the wages in US dollars would be like $10 a day, so it's barely anything. So they can't really afford it. So you're gonna see the higher income classes getting these wines. In Brazil, they're able to mechanize a lot more than Thailand can, and they produce cheaper wines that are like under $5 a bottle. They make a little bit more. So you do see more of a domestic market. Brazil isn't exporting too much. Thailand is to the neighboring countries, Singapore, China, these other countries that have higher incomes, maybe not overall, but higher income individuals that can afford it. Otherwise, that's about the extent, I would say.
All right, we need to wrap up. Please join me in thanking Coby for a great presentation. If you're interested in the Dreer, watch the horticulture lister and/or reach out to Martin, who would be happy to share some information. I think. Thanks.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.